Imagine this, a former US president standing under the brightest lights of the world stage. Across from him, a young African leader in his military red beret, calm, unshaken, and carrying the weight of a continent on his shoulders. Cameras roll. Millions watch live. The debate begins like theater, but ends like a funeral for one man's legacy, because within minutes, a single question slices through the lies of power. A question tied to one of the darkest scandals of modern history. Epstein's Island. And when the silence falls, it's not just Trump who crumbles, it's an entire empire, exposed for the world to see. This isn't fiction. This is the cinematic unraveling of a man who thought he could never be touched. Stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will shock you, haunt you, and make you question everything about who really runs the world. The world held its breath. In a glittering hall of glass and steel, lit by the sharp glow of cameras and watched by billions across continents, two men stood poised for a confrontation no one thought would ever happen. On one side, Donald J. Trump, the brash former president of the United States, infamous for his arrogance and larger-than-life persona. On the other, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, a man whose very name had become a spark of defiance against centuries of Western dominance. The announcement of this debate had been dismissed at first as a publicity stunt, a desperate bid for Trump to claw back relevance, and a risky gamble for Traoré, who was increasingly becoming the face of a rising Africa. But now, with the entire planet watching, the stakes had grown beyond politics. It was no longer just a debate. It was a battle of visions, the fading arrogance of empire versus the fierce clarity of resistance. The stage was set. Trump smirked, pacing with the swagger of a man who believed no one could touch him. He cracked jokes, waved at the cameras, and mocked Traoré as just another little general from a forgotten place. His supporters cheered in the auditorium, intoxicated by his bravado. Traoré, by contrast, stood motionless. His red beret sat firm upon his head, his eyes sharp, his posture composed like stone carved from history. He said nothing, not even a greeting. That silence unsettled more than any words could. For within it was a weight, the weight of Sankara's ghost, of centuries of plunder, of the starving faces of children buried in shallow graves because of sanctions and stolen wealth. The hook tightened. The narrator's voice dropped. It was supposed to be entertainment, a spectacle where the old world mocked the new. But what unfolded would tear open wounds long buried, and by the third question, it was no longer a debate. It was an unmasking. What Ibrahim Traoré revealed that night would haunt Donald Trump forever. Long before the cameras flickered on, forces moved in the shadows. Trump's advisors had crafted the plan carefully. They would corner Traoré with questions about his past, accusations of coups, whispers of authoritarianism, claims that he was merely a pawn of Moscow. The Western press had already sharpened their knives, ready to amplify Trump's blows, ready to remind the world that Africa's leaders could never stand equal to the West. But Traoré was not walking into a trap. He carried with him something far heavier than scripted talking points. He carried memory. He carried history. And unlike Trump, he had nothing to lose. Burkina Faso had been starved by sanctions, its gold siphoned by foreign banks, its children left hungry by IMF ultimatums. And yet, in the midst of despair, Traoré had risen, not to enrich himself, but to embody the spirit of Sankara, to ignite the idea that dignity was worth more than aid. His rise was no accident. It was the eruption of centuries of quiet suffering. And so, as Trump strutted and cracked his jokes, Traoré's silence was not weakness. It was preparation. He knew that when the questions came, he would not only answer, he would turn them into weapons. The cameras rolled. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2. The first question was asked. Trump leaned in, his smile wide, his voice dripping with mockery. Tell us, Captain Traoré, you speak of justice, but didn't you seize power by force? Didn't you betray your own leaders to take control of a poor, forgotten country? How can someone with blood on his hands lecture the world about democracy? The crowd roared. The Western press scribbled. Hashtags exploded. This was the attack they had waited for. Traoré raised his head slowly. His eyes did not waver. His voice was low, deliberate, unshaken. He spoke of colonial violence, of centuries where power had been seized not for the people, but against them. He recounted how democracies had armed dictators, how America itself had crushed movements that sought freedom in Africa. He reminded them that Sankara, the man who gave free healthcare, who vaccinated millions, who gave women their rights, had been assassinated with Western blessing. The crowd shifted. The first cracks of unease spread. Trump, impatient, interrupted. But every interruption only magnified Traoré's calm. The balance was tilting. The second question came, sharper, crafted to wound. "If you hate the West so much," Trump sneered, "why do you still use our systems, our money, our aid? Without us, Africa would collapse. Isn't that the truth?" A dangerous hush fell. Even Traoré's allies wondered how he would answer. But Traoré did not flinch. He spoke of Africa's stolen trillions, of how aid was a mask for plunder, of how empires left chains where they could not leave armies. He spoke of a generation of African children rising, educated, connected, unafraid. His words cut deeper than any weapon. And then came the third question. Trump leaned back, smirking, believing this would end it. His advisors had whispered it would be the fatal blow. "And what about your past, Captain? What about the things you don't want the world to know? You talk about justice, but isn't it true that you've been connected to men who have dark histories? Let's talk about your past." The trap was sprung, but Traoré did not stumble. Instead, he leaned forward. For the first time, and with measured precision, he asked his own question. "You want to speak of the past? Then let us speak of yours. Tell the world, Mr. Trump, where were you when Epstein's planes took flight? Where were you when girls disappeared into that island of shame? You ask me about justice. I ask you about Epstein Island. Tell the children of the world why your name was on that list." The auditorium froze. Gasps erupted. The moderator stuttered. Trump's face drained of color. For the first time, he had no words, and across the world, billions watching felt it. The moment a fortress cracked, the narrator's voice sharpened. That night, the past did not haunt Ibrahim Traoré. It haunted Trump, and from the ashes of one question, a global firestorm would begin. The silence that followed was not silence at all. It was the roar of a billion screens, the clicking of keyboards, the storm of voices rising faster than any moderator could control. Cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. His lips parted, but no words came. The smirk that had carried him through scandals, trials, and ridicule faltered in real time. The media anchors rushed to fill the void, their voices trembling as they attempted to cut through the moment. The captain's remarks are unfounded. He's diverting. These are dangerous accusations. Their scripts, rehearsed for weeks, now sounded hollow, rehearsed, powerless, against the force of what had just been spoken. But social media needed no prompting. Hashtags exploded across platforms within seconds. Jar Epstein list, Jar Traoré exposes Trump, Jar Africa speaks. The digital battlefield ignited. Clips spread faster than official networks could censor them. Young Africans in Ouagadougou, Lagos, and Johannesburg filmed themselves cheering, dancing in the streets as if a chain had snapped. College students in Europe rewound the moment again and again, their faces pressed to screens. Even in America, millions whispered the same thought. He said it out loud. Trump tried to laugh it off, tried to interrupt, tried to wave his hand as though swatting away a fly. But every twitch of his face, every slip of his words became another meme, another weapon turned against him. His advisors, sitting in the shadows, shifted uncomfortably. They had warned him not to push too far. They had not expected the counterstrike, and the debate did not stop. The moderators, desperate to regain control, moved to the next question, their voices shaking, but the damage had been done. The world no longer listened to their script. The story had already slipped beyond their grasp. Behind closed doors in Washington, Biden was briefed almost instantly. His aides tried to downplay it, to insist it was nothing but internet hysteria. But the president knew better. He had seen how moments like these could fracture entire narratives. In Beijing, Xi Jinping leaned back in his chair, a thin smile on his face as his ministers whispered, "A devastating loss for Trump, a devastating loss for the West." In Moscow, the Kremlin halls echoed with laughter. Across Africa, ministers and presidents exchanged knowing looks. History had shifted. The air inside the debate hall grew heavy. Traoré had not raised his voice. He had not insulted. He had not raged. He had simply asked a question no Western leader, no journalist, no judge had dared to ask live before billions. And in that simplicity lay the dagger. Trump's media defenders scrambled. On Fox, anchors shouted that Traoré was spreading conspiracies. On CNN, analysts warned that the captain was being reckless. On the BBC, commentators spoke of irresponsible theater, but the clips online told another story. No edits, no spin, just raw truth, played again and again. Trump caught in silence. The people decided for themselves. And once the people decide, no network can stop them. The hours after the debate became a blur of chaos. Protests erupted outside U.S. embassies in Africa. Young men and women marched with placards showing screenshots of Trump's frozen face. His silence replayed on giant screens in the squares of Bamako and Accra. In New York, activists dragged banners across Manhattan bridges with a single phrase, Epstein's List. In Burkina Faso, mothers lit candles, whispering prayers of victory as though a battle had been won without bullets. Soldiers in dusty barracks replayed the clip, their faces glowing with pride. For once, the humiliation was not theirs. For once, the shame was on the empire. Trump himself retreated backstage after the event, his fists clenched, his voice trembling with rage at his team. He demanded explanations, demanded to know how this African upstart had blindsided him. His advisors offered nothing but excuses, muttered apologies, promises that the media would bury it. But even they knew it could not be buried. Not anymore. The digital world had already immortalized it. Millions of phones carried the clip. Millions of hearts carried the feeling. The moment Traoré spoke the forbidden words, something irreversible had happened. And as dawn broke across continents, the question lingered like a storm cloud. Was this simply humiliation for one man? Or was it the beginning of a reckoning too vast to contain? The story had only begun to unfold. The world woke restless. Screens everywhere pulsed with the same frozen image. Trump's lips parted, his eyes wide, the silence that had cost him everything. Anchors tried to drown it with explanations, but the clip was beyond them now, unshakable, replayed in classrooms, in markets, in crowded buses. In dusty alleys of Ouagadougou, children shouted Traoré's question as if it were a song. In sleek towers of New York, executives watched with unease, whispering about the collapse of control. Trump's team rushed into damage control. They called emergency meetings with media allies, demanding the narrative be rewritten. Articles appeared within hours. Unfounded smear by African leader. Dangerous conspiracy distracts from real issues. Editors scrambled to dilute the clip, replacing it with polished headlines. But the people had already made their choice. They trusted the unedited moment over any crafted spin. The raw silence of Trump spoke louder than the loudest op-eds, and then came the wave of reactions. Biden's press secretary, her voice tight, admitted it had been a challenging night for the former president. But behind closed doors, Biden had told his circle, "This is the kind of blow you don't recover from." In Europe, leaders danced around their words, unwilling to anger Washington, but unable to ignore the spectacle. In Beijing, Xi spoke carefully, but the grin on his face was unmistakable, as he called it a demonstration of shifting winds. Even Putin, never missing a chance to exploit weakness, issued a cold statement about truths spoken on global stages. It was no longer just about Trump. It was about an empire wounded in its pride, exposed in its hypocrisy. And at the center of it, a young captain from Burkina Faso, who had said less than 100 words but left the world trembling. Trump, however, was not finished. Enraged, he demanded to face Traoré again, to retake control, to bury him with aggression. He stormed into interviews, his voice raised, his hands flailing, accusing Traoré of being a puppet, a radical, a liar. But every appearance only sharpened the contrast. Trump sweating, shouting, spiraling. Traoré calm, still unmovable. The silence of stone against the storm. Whispers began to circulate. Intelligence agencies leaked old photos trying to discredit Traoré, painting him as unstable, dangerous. Think tanks pushed reports warning of a new African populism. Yet these too backfired. For the more they attacked, the more people saw fear, and fear spread where they least expected. In Paris, where colonial influence had long dictated Africa's destiny, youth filled the streets, carrying flags of Burkina Faso, chanting Traoré's name. In Dakar, in Kinshasa, in Nairobi, murals of his red beret appeared overnight. His face became not just a leader's face, but a symbol. Resistance painted in blood and fire, hope rising from despair. The climax brewed not on the debate stage, but in the world beyond it. Trump's empire of words cracked under the weight of a single unanswered question. The arrogance that had once cowed rivals now looked fragile. And Ibrahim Traoré, who had walked into the hall as a regional figure, walked out as something else entirely. A storm, breaking the silence of centuries. The narrator's voice fell like a hammer. It began as a debate. It became a trial. And by the end of the third question, the jury was no longer in Washington or London or Paris. The jury was the world, and the verdict was written in fire. The hall of glass where the debate had ended was empty now, but its echoes had not faded. They lived on in every news cycle, every glowing phone screen, every whispered conversation in cafes and ministries around the globe. What had begun as entertainment had grown into something vast, uncontrollable, terrifying to those who once commanded narratives with ease. The climax was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and its center was a single name: Epstein. Trump had always believed scandals were storms he could outrun. A lawsuit, a tape, a headline, they would come and go, but his bluster, his spectacle, would carry him through. But this time was different. This time, his silence had been captured in real time. This time, the question had not come from a journalist he could insult, nor from a court he could delay, but from an African soldier, live on stage, in front of billions. There was no escape hatch. The fallout deepened with each passing hour. Investigative journalists, once hesitant, now smelled blood. Old documents resurfaced, Epstein's flight logs, photographs long buried in archives, testimonies that had been dismissed as rumor. They spread like wildfire across social platforms, stitched together by thousands of amateur sleuths. Hashtags burned through the digital ether. Our Epstein files, or is Traoré truth, Trump exposed. Each clip of Trump's faltering face was replayed against the backdrop of these revelations, and the connection grew undeniable in the eyes of the masses. Trump raged. He called into friendly networks, shouting that it was all lies, that Traoré was a puppet of enemies, that the list was fake. But every word only fueled the flames. The harder he shouted, the clearer his desperation became. Even his allies in Congress began to distance themselves. The silence of one unanswered question had broken more than his composure. It had cracked the armor of untouchability he had worn for decades. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré did not speak again. He gave no interviews, issued no triumphant statements. His silence became a weapon sharper than any reply. The world projected onto it what they needed: defiance, purity, the voice of the oppressed striking down the corrupt. His stillness was more powerful than Trump's noise. In Washington, Biden convened a closed-door meeting. His advisors debated, should the administration publicly defend Trump or allow him to sink under his own weight? Biden, weary, finally muttered, "This isn't just about him. This is about us. The whole system looks weak." Across the ocean, European leaders echoed the same fear. If one African leader could humiliate a man like Trump on live television, what did that mean for the pillars of Western dominance? And then came the moment that cemented the climax. A leaked clip emerged, a shaky recording from inside the debate's preparation room. In it, one of Trump's aides could be heard boasting that they had a past question that would corner Traoré and finish him off. The irony was cruel. The very trap they had planned was now seen as a setup, a sinister ploy that backfired catastrophically. The revelation painted Trump not just as humiliated, but as manipulative, conniving, a man undone by his own arrogance. Crowds swelled in African capitals. They carried banners not just with Traoré's face, but with names of their own forgotten leaders, men and women silenced by coups, assassinations, or foreign pressure. The question to Trump had become more than a strike against one man. It was a mirror held to the world, a reminder of the blood under the floorboards of empires. Social media platforms strained under the weight of the conversation. Algorithms, built to suppress certain topics, were overwhelmed. Even when posts were deleted, screenshots multiplied. Attempts to bury the story only made it stronger. The Streisand effect was global now, and unstoppable, and in Trump's own country, the cracks grew wider. Protesters gathered outside courthouses, demanding investigations into Epstein's network, demanding accountability from the powerful. Politicians squirmed, billionaires hid, names were whispered in fear. For years, Epstein's Island had been a rumor on the edges of public consciousness. Now, thanks to one question, it was the centerpiece of a storm that could not be silenced. Trump, once untouchable, found himself cornered. Not by lawyers, not by rivals, but by truth itself. He lashed out on stage appearances, calling Traoré a nobody, a fake soldier, a clown from a poor country. But each insult fell flat. They no longer echoed as they once had. Instead, they revealed a man unraveling, a titan shrinking. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré walked through the streets without ceremony. Mothers embraced him, children followed him, soldiers saluted. He gave no speeches, yet his presence was enough. The world's cameras tried to capture it, but the essence was beyond film. A leader who had spoken once, and in that single moment, cracked the facade of power. The climax was not thunderous. It was slow, steady, undeniable, the erosion of a mountain by a single persistent tide. Trump's downfall was not sealed in a courtroom, nor in an election, but in the silence after a question. A silence that billions heard and billions remembered. The narrator's voice trembled with weight. They thought it was just a debate. They thought it was a spectacle to humiliate an African soldier. But it became something far greater. It became the moment a mask slipped, the moment one question shattered decades of arrogance. By the end of that night, Trump was no longer the one on trial. The empire itself stood exposed. The aftermath did not unfold in a single day. It stretched out like ripples across an endless sea. The debate had ended, but its consequences had only just begun. Every corner of the world buzzed with the same memory: Trump's silence when the question of Epstein's Island pierced the stage. A silence heavier than any confession, louder than any denial. In the United States, panic gripped the political establishment. For years, whispers of Epstein's black book had been pushed aside, hidden under layers of distraction and denial. But now the whispers had become shouts. Protesters gathered outside courthouses, carrying signs that read, "No more secrets," and "Justice for the victims." The public demanded to know who else had visited that island, who else had hidden behind their power. Trump was no longer just a political figure. He was the face of an entire corrupt system. Congress convened emergency hearings. A bipartisan committee, something rare in Washington, was announced to reopen investigations into Epstein's network. High-profile names trembled. CEOs, princes, even ex-presidents were dragged back into the spotlight. And though many of them denied, deflected, or claimed ignorance, the tide had shifted. The public was no longer willing to accept silence. For Trump, the humiliation was unbearable. Once hailed as a master of media, he now found himself cornered by it. Every attempt to spin the story only deepened his downfall. He stormed into interviews, calling Traoré a fraud, accusing Biden of plotting against him, even suggesting the whole world was conspiring to silence him. But the more he shouted, the more he looked like a man drowning. Meanwhile, the global stage was changing. In Africa, Traoré's name spread like wildfire. From Dakar to Nairobi, his image was painted on murals, shared in chants, invoked in protests. He was not seen as a perfect man, but as a symbol, a leader unafraid to speak the truth in a world where others bowed. His silence after the question became a lesson, repeated again and again. Strength is not in noise, but in knowing when to let truth speak for itself. In Europe, Leaders struggled with what this meant. Macron, Schultz, and others gave careful statements calling for serious reflection, but privately admitting they had been caught off guard. In China, the state media framed it as proof of Western hypocrisy, how the so-called guardians of democracy had sheltered monsters among them. President Xi's government used the moment to strengthen its ties with African nations, presenting itself as a cleaner alternative to the decaying West. And Biden? His reaction was weary, almost resigned. At a press conference, he simply said, "We must face the truth no matter how painful. America cannot move forward until it acknowledges its own shadows." It was a rare moment of honesty, but it could not erase the damage. The image of Trump, silent under Traoré's question, had already become history's turning point. Social media was relentless. Memes flooded timelines. Clips of the moment were set to music, slowed down, remixed, analyzed frame by frame. But alongside the mockery, there was something deeper. Conversations about power, corruption, and justice. Survivors of Epstein's crimes came forward, emboldened by the shift. Their voices, once ignored, now dominated the discourse. What was once taboo had become the center of global reckoning. In Ouagadougou, Traoré remained composed. He did not gloat, did not give fiery speeches. Instead, he continued with his work, visiting farms, meeting students, inspecting infrastructure projects. His refusal to bask in the glory only elevated him further in the eyes of the world. He was not a man chasing headlines. He was a man who had exposed them. The resolution of the story was not clean. Power rarely crumbles in one strike. Trump still had his supporters, his rallies, his echo chambers. They claimed it was all fabricated, that Epstein's island was a myth, that Traoré was a foreign pawn. But their voices grew weaker, drowned out by the sheer weight of evidence, by the undeniable image of a leader undone by truth. For Africa, the impact was profound. Leaders who once bowed to Western pressure found new confidence. Citizens demanded accountability not just from America, but from their own governments. The phrase "ask the question" became a slogan, painted on walls and sung in protests. It was a reminder that truth, once spoken, could shake empires. Historians would later mark that debate as a defining moment of the 21st century, the night a soldier from Burkina Faso forced the world to confront what it had long tried to bury. Not through violence, not through war, but with a question that cracked the illusion of invincibility, and as the narrator's voice closed the tale, it carried the weight of prophecy. Empires do not fall with thunder. They fall with silence. They fall when the truth is spoken and no answer comes. On that night, in that hall of glass, the silence of a man became the roar of a generation. And the world was never the same again.